All right, so this is some core information architecture. We are going to talk about some of the things about information architecture that you just need to know in order to be successful. First, taxonomy, then navigation. A lot of times when people start to do information architecture, they're very focused on the need to deal with the navigation. Well, we have to figure out how people are going to navigate. And my answer to them is that you need to focus on the taxonomy first. Think about the categorization you're going to do, the metadata, the fields, the values, all that stuff. That comes first. Because taxonomy is understanding the order and nature of the content. It is understanding it. And then navigation is just simply trying to solve the findability problem. You can't solve a problem you don't understand. The Wright brothers, as you see this picture of the Wright Flyer monument, figured out the physics of flight. Samuel Langley also were studying physics of flight. But the Wright brothers spent painstaking efforts with models and testing aerodynamics and trying to figure out how to make things very light and create lift. And that is what led them to be first. They figured out the fundamentals before they worried about, can we go show how to fly? At the core of information architecture is a content inventory. What do we have? If we don't know what we have to organize, then how the heck can we organize it? We want to identify those things which are important, and that means frequently used or required, important, regulatory required, whatever. And then in those, we identify the metadata. So what fields do they have? What values do they have? We're trying to figure out what's the big blocks. How does it all fit together? So let's take a look at what an inventory detail might look like. Now, we're not trying to get literally every single file enumerated. We're just really trying to get types. You can go to sources, maybe one of them's a file share, or maybe another one's SharePoint. And inside those sources are going to be folders, and inside those folders are going to be files. When I'm doing a content inventory, I'm trying to figure out what are the big categories. As it turns out, on a file share, folders tend to be those categories. And in SharePoint, it could be that the site itself is a category, or a library inside the site is a category, or maybe it's still a folder inside the library. We're trying to figure out, do I have invoices? Do I have purchase orders? Do I have the big things? And what are people trying to get to? Maybe I've got policies and procedures. What's the information architecture process? Well, first, we start with, what are the organizational goals? What does the organization want out of the information architecture? Is it findability? Is it hospitability so that you can adapt? Is it having the consumers look for themselves? Those are good questions to start with. And then the scope. Are you doing an information architecture for your intranet or for all your file storage? Is it the entire enterprise content management system? What's the scope of your process? Content, we've been talking about the content inventory. What's the content? What's the information that's being managed? And then the process is what's being done with it. A lot of times you shift the way that you organize the information based on the people that need to touch it and the systems. Then you do the ranges and values so that you know what things that you're going to have. So a field has 3 states. You're going to know what those 3 states are. Last, we manage visual, which is our navigation, right? Before we get much further, I have to talk about target usage. In information architecture, there's often this need to differentiate between communication, which is one-to-many and very controlled, and it's designed for people to feel in the know, whether that's policies, procedures, news, whatever it is. It's very much about being in the know, as compared with an information architecture for collaboration, where everybody's writing, and it's largely uncontrolled. So if there's these two different things, why do we have a tendency to make one information architecture? And the answer is, we don't think about the fact that collaboration's a little different. You still want to provide some structure and framing so that people can move from one group to another, but you don't necessarily want to tightly control it like you would for communication. So sometimes when we're creating an information architecture, we have 2 architectures to create. One for the communication type solutions and the other for the collaborative type solutions. So, all right, if you're just going to try and do this quickly, what are you going to do? You're going to gather the attributes, determine which of them are essential. Then you're going to identify the values that are in it, create your ranges and groups, and then you're going to design your navigation and search. So it's a flow that takes you up through some very low-level stuff, but gets you into higher and higher levels of organization. Would I do just this if I'm doing a large investment? No. If I'm doing something big, I'll take the time and I'll walk through the full set of materials. But if I'm just trying to do something quick and dirty, I've got a quick little app and it needs a little bit of information architecture, I'll often simplify it to these 5 steps just so that I can get something out there that's a good structure to start from. We've talked about metadata a couple of times, and this is a situation where we have different kinds of metadata. Some of the metadata we get automatically. Intrinsic, like file size and item type, those are intrinsic to it. We also get derived things, who was it created by and when, and same thing with modified. Those kinds of metadata come on their own. And then we have declared. And if you're in SharePoint, it's a list and library field or whatever the system is. You can do terms, which are more a consistent set of terms across multiple things like keywords. And then you can also internally to a document have document properties that are sometimes promoted into your content management system. So it's fine to have metadata that is intrinsic and all of that, but how do we manage the content and what does it mean to manage it? There's basically 2 basic types of content curation. And one is the news reporter. This is the person who's highlighting information and bringing it up to the front page. It's the person who's identifying the things that are important that are going on. The other kind of content curation, and it's the one that we spend most of our time focusing on with information architecture and how does the architecture live over time, is someone who is a librarian. They're maintaining the shelves. They're making sure that things are filed in the appropriate place. In the electronic sense, that means they're going through and doing tag cleaning. So if you should be saying automobile and someone puts in a tag for car, they merge the tags and move the files around a little bit so that all the tags are consistent. That's really a lot of what content curation is. Really, they're converting gates to pathways. And what I mean by that is that where people would have trouble matching terms, they're going to bring those terms together so that people always use the term that the organization thinks is the right one. So I think every one of us has had some sort of a problem with binge eating. It's called Thanksgiving. At least in the United States and across the world, it's Christmas. We eat too much and we know it. So from a metadata standpoint, as we're looking at the need for content curation and some of the stuff is intrinsic, and well, how much do we do with this metadata stuff? And the answer is as much as we can. And that varies for organization. Our goal is to not be overwhelming with the amount of metadata that they need to put in. If you're going to ask for metadata, make sure you're going to use it somehow. Maybe it's searching, maybe it's filtering, maybe it's reporting, but somehow make sure that whatever metadata you capture, you're going to use. Now, there's 2 ways to look at metadata. And the first is that it's blocking. It's required before you can complete the edit. And that's great, but there are some times where that makes it difficult to partially enter a record and then come back to it later. So there's a non-blocking approach. And the idea is that you follow up when the data is missing. So if you take a look at this from a tooling standpoint, it may be that you don't actually use the required field functionality of your document management system. Instead, you have a system or workflow or something that goes in behind and checks up on the records that are added to make sure that they have the right information. A long time ago as an intern, that was one of my jobs, was to look at the data and make sure it was clean as it went into a chemical database. It was a pretty simple job, but it was great that we didn't stop the researchers from entering their information if they just didn't have a particular value. One of the common questions I get is, how do you staff an information architecture project? So what does it mean and how does that work and how many people do I need? Well, the answer is that it changes based on the project size, but here's some rough guidelines. First, you're going to have some sort of a phase around content inventory, and you've got an information architect leading a set of BAs. So the size of the inventory will determine the number of BAs, but you have one IA generally leading a set of BAs. Then you do your card sorting, both your open and closed card sorting, and you're going to do an IA leading and generally one BA supporting. Now this BA that's supporting is typically assisting with facilitation. It might be more than one if you're doing a lot of groups simultaneously, but it's generally 2 people-ish that will be facilitating card sorting. The last little bit is fine-tuning. Generally, the information architect is going to be the person who's doing this process. They're going to be working on fine-tuning and, well, these 2 groups had this and which answer is better and how do we test that? A lot of this, again, depends on the experience of the information architect. A really experienced information architect is going to get things done quicker. And the other side of it is quality desired. You've got an initial target for how good should the architecture that they come up with be? How good should the taxonomy be? If it just has to be close, well, you don't need as much time. If you feel like making changes in the future is really, really difficult politically or for some other reason, well, then you may want to spend a few more cycles on it, doing maybe a few more card sorts, a few more tests, and a few more prototypes. So the goal here is not to say, oh, there's, it's 5.3 man years or whatever it is. It's really, here are the things to think about as you're trying to figure out how to staff your information architecture project. Before we get too much further, I have to say that every information architecture project I've ever been a part of is what we would call a brownfield project. We take projects and we break them into 2 categories, brownfield and greenfield. Greenfield is there's nothing there, and a brownfield is you've got something existing that you've got to deal with. And almost all information architecture work, there's some sort of an existing architecture. Now, it may be formal, it may be informal, it may be file shares, it may be a website, but generally speaking, you start in a brownfield. So you have to consider what you should change. This is the stuff that just really needs to change. What you can change, you could do it if you wanted to. What you should not change because it'll be too disruptive, or what you can't change because it'll kill the project, or you'll piss off the wrong people and the project will get canceled. So sometimes there's an answer that's right for information architecture reasons, but for political reasons or organizational reasons or bureaucratic reasons, you probably shouldn't go there.